the way, Professor Labianca, will you kindly give permission to record the webinar?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It will also be broadcasted on our YouTube channel later on. Thank you.
So I would have dressed better.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing very well today, this evening. We have an exciting webinar on the effects role in organizationally sponsored networking. Our guest speaker is Professor Labianca. It's both an honor and privilege to have him with us this remarkable event. His wealth of knowledge and expertise in our field is truly exceptional, and we are grateful, very grateful that he has taken the time to share his insights with us this evening. And this webinar actually serves a vital role in advancing our mission of the Turkish Academy of Management, which is to create a common discussion and development ground for researchers and practitioners in the field of management and organization. It is through these events like this one that foster collaboration, knowledge exchange, and growth within our community. And now I'd like to take a moment to highlight Professor Labianca's impressive biography before listening to his presentation. Giuseppe Joy Labianca is the professor of leadership at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst Eisenberg School of Management. His research examines various organizational behavior and organizational theory topics from a social network perspective, with an emphasis on negative interpersonal ties. Specific topics he has examined include ostracism, conflict, post-merger integration, turnover, innovation, group processes, power and politics, positive and negative gossip, and organizational design and change. Joy employs a wide variety of research methods, including surveys, big data analytics, experiments, qualitative researches. He serves as a department editor for Decision Sciences and on the editorial boards of the Journal of Applied Psychology, Organizational Science, and Organizational Psychology Review. In addition to these journals, his work has appeared in Science, the Academy of Management Journal, and the Academy of Management Review, among others. He recently co-edited a special issue of Social Networks on negative ties and sign graphs. Prior to joining the Eisenberg School faculty in 2020 and 21, Joy was on the faculty at the Gotham College of Business and Economics at the University of Kentucky, the Guizeta Business School of Emory University, and the Freeman School of Business at Tulane University. Joy has worked with numerous corporate partners, including most recently with Valvoline and Timber-Sealy, where he served on its Organization Development and Leadership Council for 3 years. So, dear members, I hope you're as inspired as I am by Professor Labianca's impressive background. So, with such a wealth of knowledge and experience, we are in for a truly enlightening presentation. So without further delay, I invite Professor Labianca to take the virtual stage and share his expertise with us. Professor Labianca, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you, Meral. And thank you all. This is a great honor, first off, to be asked to do this, but also the incredible honor of having you all share a Friday night. I know it's very late for all of you. I'm sure you're exhausted after a long week. And I really appreciate you coming to this to hear about this work that we've been doing. It's a collaborative effort with a lot of junior faculty, Andy Lee, Sungwon Yang, Anna Smith, and Philip Agnesens, and Feng Xu. have all been working very hard on this, and we're still at a relatively early stage. So we haven't even finished the first draft of this paper, and it's about, we're hoping that within the next month, we can send it off to a journal. So I would invite you to think about what I'm presenting and then provide me any feedback at the end. And I'm happy to stay on for a while to discuss also projects that you're working on and the such. So thank you again for coming. The main topic of what I'll be discussing today is really organizationally sponsored networking. So what do I mean by that? This picture here is an example of an event that was put on by an organization specifically because they want people to meet from other departments. And they want them to get to know each other because they understand that this is extremely valuable for an organization for people to have these kind of cross-cutting network ties. The difficulty is that we have to think about people's feelings when you get put into a situation like this to really get a good understanding of what's going to happen. Are people actually going to meet each other? And if they do, are they going to stay in touch with each other? Because if they don't, then what's the value of even having a meeting like this? So that's going to be the main purpose, is to go into a couple of these events, follow them over time, and see what ends up happening. So to take a step back, anytime that you have a small organization, everybody, of course, and organically interact with each other. And so there's not much need to worry about the network. But as an organization grows more complex, you end up with multiple functions and units that end up emerging. And then we get a very complex, differentiated organization. Well, what ends up happening is that each unit, each department is really getting focused on their own specialty area, and they are promoting interaction and interpersonal interaction within their silo, within each formal subsystem, and their tasks are much more interdependent. They have more common knowledge. They'll develop a common language. All of that is to be expected, but what ends up happening then is that they start to lose track of what happens in the other silos, in the other areas. And this begins to create barriers to exchanging across the different units. And that can not only be seen in, hey, we begin to separate, we're on different floors, or we're in different buildings. So we see physical distance developing, but also we start to develop dissimilarities even in who we hire into these areas, what we think about, our knowledge domains. All of this makes it much more difficult for us to have these relationships that cut across the different silos in an organization. And organizations recognize this. They recognize these dysfunctions that these barriers create. It becomes difficult to share knowledge across the different areas. It becomes difficult to collaborate across the entire organization. And what ends up happening is that any time that we can't just rely on a routine to take care of the problems that we're facing, it becomes more and more difficult for the organization to deal with exceptions to normal organizational functioning. So knowing that these people in these silos start to lose track of what's happening in the big picture of the organization, what they end up doing is overemphasizing their limited subunit goals. So if you're in the marketing department, you start to see what you want to do as being whatever is best for the marketing department You start to lose the focus that, hey, the marketing department is just one piece of this larger organization. And really, that's where our focus needs to be, not just on what we're doing within one department. So organizations see this dysfunction, particularly at the top, and they try to address these limitations. They can't just get rid of a structure. They need to have that kind of differentiated structure. But what they're looking to do is limit the problems, the dysfunctions. And one of the ways that they try to do that is to encourage informal relationship building among employees and across the different areas, with the idea being that if I'm sitting in marketing and I have a friend in finance, when there's a problem, I can reach out and just deal with that person on an informal basis, and that will help everybody without having to change the formal structure of the organization. And we know that these informal relationships play a very important role because they transfer a lot of knowledge across the formal boundaries, and they allow for collaborative innovation. So when we do get these problems that are new problems, and we have to innovate, we're going to go to those people that we have informal relationships with, and we'll figure out how to deal with these problems with new innovation. So because organizations recognize the importance of these informal relationships, they tend to want to host networking events. And these types of networking events, you'll see some of them are formal, so they will have seminars, they'll sponsor internal conferences, workshops, and then some of them are informal, so they'll host social hours, company picnics, year-end mixers, all kinds of events, with the idea being, let's bring people together and let's get them to meet each other. These events are often very well intended. They tend to be very well attended too. People feel like, okay, I need to go to this. The companies tend to spend a good amount of money putting them on. But what we know is that even the employees themselves recognize that, hey, I should be doing this. There's benefits to me knowing people in other areas. And they will go to these with the intention that, hey, I want to meet other people. I want to get to know more people. Unfortunately, we also know that these events don't actually do what they're intended to do. People do not establish new informal ties. Most of the time, we talk about this as a knowing-doing gap. We know in our heads that we should form a new tie, but we go to these mixers with our friends, we stand around talking to only our friends, and even if we meet somebody new, we don't follow up with them afterwards. So in general, there's that knowing-doing gap when it comes to networking behavior. So why is that? What underlies this knowing-doing gap? There's a few different theories about why this might be the case. One potential mechanism that's been brought up quite a bit in the network literature is this idea of your affect towards networking, how you feel about networking. And the idea is, let's look at how people feel towards networking at these kinds of events. And if we understand that better, then we'll understand why this behavior doesn't actually work at these events. So when management researchers have tended to look at affect, what they've focused on is just negative emotionality towards instrumental networking. So the idea of instrumental networking is I'm meeting somebody with a very specific purpose in mind. It's a professional relationship. It's not intended to be kind of a personal relationship. And the idea being that people react negatively to that, that they don't feel that that is a right thing to do. And this type of professional networking can breed feelings of dirtiness, inauthenticity, being artificial, being fake. And that's really where the research has been, with all of these things saying that, hey, people have networking phobia. They really don't want to do it at all. And I agree with some of this. It's true that some types of instrumental networking are terrible. So this is everybody's, or most everybody's, nightmare. This is Mitt Romney. He's a politician in the US. And this is everybody's view of what instrumental networking is. You put a fake grin on your face and you're trying to shake everybody's hand in a room like a politician. This is what we have been talking about in the network realm with regard to networking. But it's a very caricatured view of what networking actually is in most organizations. And it's not how people always think about it. So this is only one type of affect that we can have towards professional networking. And we want to move in our research past this kind of discrete emotion approach to thinking about networking, and rather to have a more comprehensive view of how people think about professional networking. So just as an example, one person, we did a qualitative portion to this study where we're just talking to people about, tell us about the last time you were at a networking event. How did you feel? Well, and this person said, hey, I was really excited. I'm finally able to reveal myself to a bunch of my colleagues, but I was really able to enjoy myself and feel like I made some new working connections. Well, great. This person is feeling really positive. A different person said, hey, I felt calm, relaxed. It's nice to meet up with people outside of work, but still in a professional way. It's just a nice experience. And on the negative side, yeah, you do get some people that are saying, hey, I'm extremely nervous at this idea. I've been in the sector for 20 years, and I still feel like an imposter, and I feel stressed. And yet another way of approaching this is that, hey, these social events make me feel tired, worn out, right? These are all aspects of affect. And if you think about what you're seeing here, it's a wide variety of affect, and it fits fairly nicely with the circumplex model of affect, where we've got some reactions that are negative or unpleasant, some that are positive and pleasant, some that are relatively deactivated, being calm and relaxed, tired and worn out, but some that are activated, really excited, stressed, extremely nervous. It fits kind of nicely with this more comprehensive way of viewing affect. So the circumplex model of affect, for those that have not encountered it, looks at a whole bunch of different emotions. We're looking for ours at 16 different interrelated emotions towards networking. And this model of affect proposes that any kind of affective experience can be categorized along these two bipolar dimensions. The first being valence, positive to negative, and then the other one being arousal, or this sense of mobilization and or energy from high to low. And we're going to be taking that model and going into the field. So we went to a very unusual setting. We actually went to a church setting. So we're going to be studying a whole bunch of ministers, each of whom runs a church of their own, and they're being called together at two events that are for professional networking. Each of the events is 3 days long. It's invitation only, and there were 9 different geographic regions that made up this part of this church, and only 245 high potential ministers were invited. So this was considered a great honor to be one of the people selected to come to this conference to network with these other people. Each of the ministers runs their own church, and honestly, in this system, it's very much like running your own non-governmental organization. They're really kind of the CPO of their little organization, or executive director of their organization. There are, across these 9 regions, there are 3 what are called bishops that oversee those units. So they are the upper middle management, basically, of the organization. And the bishops actually showed up to both of the events and stayed with them each for the 3 days that it took place. So the purpose of the event was specifically to do networking and to develop innovative ideas. So over that 3-day period, they built in a huge number of social events, and they're being told that what we want to see you doing is building ties across these 9 different geographical regions, with the idea being that, for example, in the southern US, because of its proximity to Latin America, for decades, they've had Spanish-speaking individuals joining these churches. And so they've had to deal with, well, what do we do when you have a traditionally English-speaking congregation, and now all of a sudden, all these people who speak a different language, and even though they're all part of the same religion, they've had different kinds of services up until now. How do we deal with that influx? Well, they've already been dealing with that for decades. Now you've got people that are from 5 states away that have never dealt with that before and are dealing with it now for the first time. So they're trying to bring solutions that have already been created and see if they can move those solutions to other areas. So the bishops are telling them, hey, our churches are undergoing many changes. You need to be innovative, you need to be creative, especially with how do we reach out to young people who always are not very interested in their parents' or grandparents' churches. So we want you to find ways to imagine something different. And what we need you to do at this conference is meet people who can walk with you on this journey. People have different expertise. We want you to know each other, and we want to forge relationships between the 9 regions. So their boss is telling them, this is what we want you to do, and it's important to us. So we're going to collect the data by, first off, before the events, we give them a survey. In that survey, we'll give them a social network roster, figure out who is in their network already. Then we went to the event, stayed there for the 3 days, and at the end of the 3 days, we see what actually ended up happening at the event, who they met for the first time. Then they have an intranet portal that they are supposed to be staying in touch with over time. So we watched that for 3 weeks, and we have the archives of that. And then we also administered a final survey just to see if they had met or followed up with people in ways that we couldn't see through the online interaction. So that's where we're going to be heading in terms of the types of data that we have. So in that first survey, which is 3 weeks before the event, we're capturing their existing network. So we asked them, we have a list of all of the 245 people that will be attending these events, and it's go through the list below, and only for the people that you've actually been interacting with at least a couple of times during the past year, either by speaking in person, phone conversations, text, personal email. So basically any way, but you've at least been in touch with them and there's at least some interaction. And so they take that roster, they check off all these people, and from that we can create, this visualization, and it's colored by the main geographic areas that they're in, and you can see that most of the interaction is within a particular geographic region, very little interaction across, and the big people that are across the different areas are the bishops, the 3 bishops. And that's very typical of what you would see in the structure, where all the interactions happening below, and then if there's a need for coordination across the units, it gets bumped up to a different level, and that's where that's happening. There's some connections across, very few, and that typically is if somebody was in one area and then moved to a different area, they still might have some friends or interaction partners. But most of it is within each unit. So then we also asked them to tell us about their affect toward networking. So to what extent do you experience the following emotions when you engage in professional networking, such as meeting peers at conferences and mixers? And on a scale of not at all to extremely, we gave them the 16 emotions in a random order and asked them how much they feel that way. Now notice we didn't do this at the event. So one of the reasons for that was that we were afraid that the reviewers might say, well, of course, if things are going well at the event, they're going to say they have positive affect. If they're not going well, they'll say negative affect. So we intentionally are asking this 3 weeks ahead of time to try to get an understanding of how they generally feel about networking. So then we went to the event and we watched them for the 3 days, and they did a lot of work in those 3 days and spent a lot of time meeting a whole bunch of new people. And at the end of the 3 days, we gave them that same roster again and said, okay, now, with whom did you have substantial interaction for the first time at the conference? So, and this was a list of the names. So this is kind of one of the reasons we chose to do it this way was, let's say I meet Meryl for the first time at a conference. If I don't even know her name, then we don't care about that interaction. But if I met her and we actually had a decent conversation, I now remember her name and I can find her name on the roster. And that's what we really care about. And then from there, we ask them, how much do you intend to follow up with this person after the conference? So again, that brings us to the end of survey 2, and then we watch what actually happens for the next 3 weeks, and then we survey them again at the end of that 3-week period to see who did they follow up with. So we ended up with 194 final usable survey responses that crossed all of the 3 time points, which is a 79% response rate. The sample is skewed. It's a little more male, and that's because in this particular religious tradition, it's been the case that it tends to be more male for the folks that are leading the congregations, but a third of them are female, and one of the 3 bishops was also female. It's also very white, which again doesn't match up with the normal population in the United States, but it's very typical of what you see in a religious institution. It tends to be fairly segregated by race, ethnicity, that sort of thing. And what I'll show you is that the network itself is about 37,000 relationships, of which about 4,800 are new interactions that happen for the first time at the conference. So our hypotheses, basically, they're fairly straightforward. The first is that the more that you have these high aroused positive feelings about networking, so you're excited by these events, you're happy to be there, you're feeling very elated to go to it, then the more likely you are to meet others that are also like that are really excited, and the more likely you are to follow up with each other. So our analyses are going to be at the dyadic level, right? If I am excited, but you're depressed, the chances that we're going to make a connection are lower than if we're both excited. So at the dyadic level, we're trying to predict, will that dyad emerge after this event? Another pretty straightforward hypothesis is if it's on the negative side, you're feeling very stressed, tense, nervous, upset about being there, you're not going to make connections, and neither will the other person. So if you've got 2 people that are feeling this way, they're less likely to meet each other and follow up. Now, most of the research has been assuming that people are activated. What happens when we go to the low arousal feelings? It's not quite clear how to create a priori hypotheses for this, because if somebody is feeling relaxed or calm, serene, are they going to be actually going out there and trying to create new ties? We're not sure. In the US especially, you'll see a lot of times when you go to these events that they will do things like try to make people relaxed by playing calm music, calm classical music. Is that really something that you want to be doing, or is it better to get them more energized and excited about the event? We weren't sure a priori, so we said, okay, maybe if people are calm and relaxed, they're more likely to meet each other, more likely to follow up. The really hard part a priori was trying to create the deactivated negative hypotheses. So what we were finding was that when you have low arousal negative feelings towards something, so you're depressed by something, sad, you feel that this can be a warning signal, and it prompts people to pay broader attention, to look at what's happening in their surroundings, and all this attention that they're paying actually comes at the price of action. So they delay actions. In this case, it's about the networking. And they kind of try to reappraise what's going on. So when you look at the problem, they initially tend to avoid the behavior that you're looking for, but then after they reappraise, we tend to see greater activity and performance in the long term as compared to those who are positive or neutral. So it's a very unusual way of approaching the world. Given that, we would expect that those people would actually be less likely to meet each other at the event, because it's in the short run, they're going to be avoiding each other. But in the long run, they're more likely to follow up because of the greater activity after they thought about it and had the space to think about it outside of the event. So we went into this with these hypotheses, and what we were obviously needing was to think about, was this affect, the way that we collected it, going to match up with the circumplex model? Because the circumplex model is just kind of a very broad model, but what we were asking about was specific to engaging in professional networking. So rather than using this generic model, we examined it towards professional networking specifically. So we ran a factor analysis, and it matched fairly well, actually, with very little cross-loading. So we did get 4 factors that came out that matched very well with the circumplex model. And then what we did was that we took the average of each factor for each individual, and then for each dyad, we summed each partner's scores on that particular factor. So we're going to be running ergoms, and we're going to be controlling for ego's extroversion, demographic characteristics like ego's and alters similarity based on gender, ethnicity, their formal rank in the organization, and their church region, as well as their values. So a big issue in these churches was their view towards homosexuality, their political views, liberal versus conservative, and how willing they were to change. So we were collecting all of these data as well. So as I mentioned, there were 37,000 dyads, 4,800 initial encounters at the event, which meant that each person met about 20 new people over those 3 days. So that's a pretty good amount. But just to show you the knowing-doing gap, they intended to only follow up with about 5 out of those 20, and then they actually only followed up with fewer than 1 person. So if you think about how much effort was spent to do this event, you'd probably look at this and say, that's kind of a failure. I mean, there's only 204 new relationships that were created. On the other hand, those are all valuable relationships, so might not be a total failure. So we ran exponential random graph models. So the idea behind these is that we're trying to predict the emergence of a dyad. And what we're doing is that we are putting in a bunch of parameters that are simulating what is happening within this network. And we're seeing whether the addition of these parameters helps us to see in the simulated networks what's actually happening in the observed network. How close are we getting to what we should be seeing? And these are the results. I'm going to try and focus in a little more on first, a few things. So we'll start with the individual covariates. Extroverts were not more likely to have initial encounters, but they were more likely to follow up with people later. The values that people had, in general, their values, dissimilarity didn't matter, but it did matter in the long term only with regards to that very hot button issue of the attitudes towards homosexuality. If they disagreed on that, they were much less likely to follow up with each other. Gender similarity meant that people encountered each other more often at the event, but it had nothing to do with the follow-up behavior. Same thing with ethnic similarity. Didn't affect long-term. Rank similarity. At the event, it mattered. Long-term, it didn't. And then the big one was, were we from the same region? And that meant we met together and we followed up with each other. Remember, the whole idea is you're supposed to be meeting people from other regions. That's not what's going on. And again, this is very typical of networks. People do what they feel like doing. They don't do what they're being asked to do that would be most helpful for the organization. We also see the number of third parties that we share in common before the event helps us to figure out who is going to meet each other at the event and actually follow up with each other after the event. So that's a very typical network phenomenon that we see. These patterns are fairly typical. This edge parameter just tells us how likely is it for people to meet each other, and it has a negative parameter. So it tells you people are not really meeting a lot of new people, but we already knew that just from the descriptives. And they're also not following up with people. So in essence, that's to be expected. People don't like to network. When it does happen, it's very centralized. So some people are nominating others and are being nominated by others. So it's very clumpy and directed towards a few people. And we tend to see a lot of triadic closure at the events. So if the two of us are interacting with a similar third party for the first time, we're also likely to meet for the first time at the event. What we're really interested in is the independent variables. So let me just get a little closer on them, and let's say even closer here. High arousal, positive emotions. So the people who are the dyads that are excited, they encounter each other more and they follow up with each other afterwards. The ones that come in relaxed are less likely to encounter each other, and there's no impact on the follow-ups. High arousal, negative emotions have no relationship either with initial encounters or with follow-ups. That's counterintuitive. And the people that are depressed or sad about doing this, at the encounters at the event, significantly lower, but they're also following up at a high rate. In fact, it's just a higher rate, if not a little higher, than the high arousal positive emotions. So very surprising set of findings. So what do we learn from this? It's really important for us to be thinking about this comprehensively in terms of affect and not just focusing on the high arousal negative emotions, because people network and feel about networking very differently around these events. yes, the high arousal positive emotions, they're associated with increased networking both at the event and after. So that would suggests, hey, let's get people energized. That might be really useful. On the other hand, trying to make people serene and calm, that seems to be actually associated with decreased networking. So trying to make people feel comfortable or relaxed might not be as useful. Those low arousal negative emotions are really interesting because they're associated with reduced networking behavior at the event, but increased follow-up behavior. And so what that would tell me is that they're creating avoidance in the short term, but action in the long term. So if I'm interested in that, I want to try, as the person putting on the event, to create opportunities for people to connect on their own time after the event. So this organization, what they did was to create kind of an intranet to keep the event going. And for these folks, that was a very useful exercise for them. And then the high arousal negative emotions actually weren't related to anything. And I find that very surprising, but I mean, this was over 2 events, and we saw the same thing happening at both events. So we found that very puzzling. I know that a reviewer is going to be asking me about this. I don't have a good answer as to why that was the case, but it was the case. So some future directions. One is that we are studying this one set of emotions at a time. So one quadrant at a time. And we could tell from the qualitative work that people did experience multiple emotions at the events. So for example, this person said, I initially felt optimistic, I was happy. However, as the event progressed, I began to feel somewhat isolated, somewhat sad. And we saw all kinds of different emotions. And I would say about a little under half of the people experienced multiple emotions throughout events. So because of that, I think that one of the things that would be great to be able to do is to try to measure the reactions, the emotional reactions to networking closer to real time. One of the ways might be to do kind of pulse surveys during the events very quickly at random periods throughout the event to see how people are feeling. Another might be maybe using sociometric badges or some other method that tie into people's physical reactions during exchanges so that we can see and monitor how they're feeling over time. But this way that we did it of asking somebody 3 weeks ahead of time is probably not ideal. And then, of course, here we're only focusing on affect. And we can also ask the question, why only think about affect? Networking has a very cognitive element as well. And maybe we should be really tapping into the behavioral intentions that people felt before they went into the networking event, and that we need to consider affect and cognition together if we want to hope to really understand behavior. So thinking about these as attitudes towards networking as a whole. So, instrumental networking at work is not going away. And one of the big picture things that I see is that we need better network intervention theories, including process theories of how do we move networks from where they are to where we'd like it to be. Some of the work that Ko Kuwabara is doing on these lay theories of networking, I think that's a promising direction. I've also seen people like David Obstfeld. He's doing terrific work with helping disadvantaged youth to professionally network so that they can get jobs. But to be able to better do this, we need better process theories to get us to actually be able to affect change. Okay, folks, so thank you very much. I would love to hear any of your questions or comments. And I'm happy to talk about anything, really.
Thank you, Professor Labianca. It was really enlightening and informative. And I am sure our audience has gained a deeper understanding of the role of affect in networking. Demet Hoca will ask a question. Please go ahead, Hocam.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Especially with regards to your future research directions, the major thing that popped in my mind was, and still is, the structure of the networking event. It needs to be studied, I do believe, because despite we want to have people networking, sometimes we do not let them interact with each other, depending on, so I'm talking about how that networking event is being managed. If there's somebody playing too much of a leader role and making a show off, do we have enough time to leave those people to, shall I say, socialize? So yeah. I do believe that you should also think about different ways those networking events are being structured. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
And I've seen my study as well as other studies have been looking at things like how much time is set aside for informal socializing. And I agree with you, that's a really interesting area. I think one of the reasons why organizations want to more overmanage, so, like this organization intentionally forced people to sit with each other that normally didn't know each other. The idea, of course, to them is, hey, we need to make sure that people from the different units are sitting together. And we know from other research, though, that the people that actually meet each other tend to be the ones that meet after the event. And so, they do have these informal settings. The problem is that if you let people do what they want, you saw the results, which is they'll meet people from their own unit, right? Which defeats the whole purpose of doing the event. It's not helpful for people to meet more people from their own unit when what you really need them to do is meet other people. So we need to find process theories for how do we get people to overcome those barriers to meeting somebody that's from an area that the organization needs. So there has to be some kind of intentionality to it. And I think that if it's informal socializing, it's more comfortable for us, but it still may not do what needs to be done. Let's put it that way. It's not very instrumental. But I agree with you. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? You can please don't hesitate to type in your questions in the chat. Oh, another question from Cenk Hoca. Go ahead, please, Hocam.
So, Dr. Labianca, thank you very much for your nice presentation. It was so interesting. So, I think that there should be,